Hello and welcome to CANNAMAntv. My name is Connor McLeod. In this very informative and insightful interview, I speak with Matthew O'Brien, editor of the increasingly popular cannabis news outlet, 4PM. In this interview, we discuss Matthew's background and what led to the creation of 4PM, recent developments with medical cannabis research, cannabis social clubs and what the UK adult use market may look like, the cannabis industry and job creation, large-scale cannabis production versus craft cannabis production, and biosynthesised cannabinoids and emerging problems with the cannabis industry. Make sure to like and subscribe and join us on Patreon, where you can help to build a stronger cannabis media platform. Now then, let's talk cannabis. Matthew, dynamite for joining me on the channel here. This is brilliant. Thanks so much.
My absolute pleasure.
So just to get us started off then, Matthew, could you give a wee background of yourself and essentially what led to you being as active as you are in the cannabis industry?
Yeah, for sure. It's funny because I think a lot of the people who have opposing views in cannabis and kind of come around to, I guess, a more sort of common sense perspective on the world are turned out to be some of the most sort of outspoken people as regards their sort of involvement in just general activism as to why we need to reform our stance on cannabis. For me, yeah, honestly, it started, I'd say, about 4 years ago, if I'm correctly unwinding the clocks here. I was in secondary school, so I'm not too sure if you call it secondary school or high school, but I know in North America it's high school. Yeah. In Europe we call it secondary school. Yeah. So I was in my final year of that, and at the time the only subject I was remotely interested in was economics. And I always done well academically. I just didn't give a shit about school. I mean, dead up honest with you, I just didn't have an interest in a lot of what the curriculum was covering. And I came across this book called Narconomics. Can literally remember coming home in the car, heard the radio presenter interviewing the author of the book, and I was like, shit. I was like, that makes a lot of sense. And decided to buy the book. Kind of felt like it was even contraband, like as if I was reading words that were sort of not meant to be spoken. Yeah. And I just couldn't help but get this feeling that, what he was presenting would effectively become the world we would live in a matter of time, because the current sort of approach we're taking to regulate substances is utterly failing. I think everyone would agree with that statement. Yeah. There are legal pharmaceutical alternatives available to just about every quote unquote drug which is illegal, which doesn't make any sense at all. It's really just penalizing people who don't necessarily have the financial wherewithal to obtain access to those products. Yeah. And at the time, didn't want to go to university and really was interested in pursuing this path of just understanding, what might the world look like if ever we do legalize all drugs. And heard about Canada legalizing cannabis, what would have been 12 months after that point in time. And decided to pack up all my things, which at the point in time was, to be honest with you, was not a whole lot. I think if I recall correctly, when I arrived in Canada, I had about $500 in my bank account, which for anyone who spent enough time in either Toronto or Vancouver is not nearly enough for a month's rent in either of those two cities. So like most immigrants do, just put my head down, got to work, started working 2 jobs just so that I could pay my bills and basically eat the cheapest chicken I could get from the grocery store. And worked my ass off, eventually, found myself managing stores. I've done a bunch of different things across the industry. I've managed supply chains. I've, managed processing facilities and currently operating 4PM.
Nice. I mean, so one of the things that I'd actually noticed on your website was that you used to do, it was like a bud tender. Was that one of the positions that you did? Yeah.
Best job I ever had.
Yeah. Talk me through that. How was that?
It was unreal, to tell you the truth, because what's kind of interesting about my story is that I moved halfway across the world to get involved in the cannabis industry, but I'd never actually consumed cannabis prior to that. So it was all just sort of an intellectual curiosity surrounding cannabis, without actually knowing, what are the effects of cannabis, what are the sort of distinction to be made between the different types of cannabis.
So just to be clear there, Matthew, you went over to Canada without, you hadn't tried cannabis before you went to Canada?
Never.
That's brilliant. I love
it. So I think it had crossed paths with me maybe twice in my entire life. I can remember being at a friend's, who was actually from Glasgow. I won't name his name, but friend from Glasgow. It was his 18th birthday party. And I can remember they all went upstairs and nobody kind of said what they were doing. And I was like, what the fuck are they doing up there? And I was told thereafter it was cannabis. So I think I'd only ever crossed my path like once in my entire life up until that point, which is interesting. But moved halfway across the world, I said, to get involved in the industry. And I went into the industry with a lot of misconceptions. I thought that, there's a very sort of specific group of people who consume cannabis, was completely, blown away by the level of sophistication the industry was operating at. Like I personally had previously worked in a grocery store for 2 years prior to moving abroad. Right. And we had these like point of sale platforms that had been built like 20 years prior to my work in there. So the software was literally older than that of myself. And then working in a cannabis retail store, like we had point of sale software that was custom built specifically for cannabis retail stores. And I just couldn't get my head around the level of sophistication the industry was operating at. Was also just blown away by the type of stores. Like if you've ever been in an Apple store, that's kind of the format a lot of cannabis retail stores are trying to emulate these days, whereby it's just a very sort of elegant layout. But I couldn't believe that these were stores selling cannabis, because my sort of preconceived idea was that, you buy cannabis off a dealer on a street corner, and then walking into a store that, you expect to buy an iPhone in, only to realize that you're being sold cannabis was a bit of a surprise.
What is the level of education that you are actually given to inform the customers?
Jack shit, to be honest with you. It's very much just like throwing the person in the water and hoping they can swim, and if not, they drown.
Yeah.
So when I initially came in, as I said at the time, I wasn't a consumer. A lot of the people who were in the industry at that point in time, so this is about, I think it was about like 8 months prior to legalization at that point, where really just in the industry because, working in the cannabis industry was cool. You got to consume cannabis, or rather you got, pretty high discounts on every single cannabis product in store. I think our discount was like 30% at the time. Now that's completely changed because you can't offer discounts. So the type of people who are coming into the industry has definitely changed a fair amount. However, at that point in time, just a lot of people were just sort of cannabis consumers, and they want to be working in the industry for that very reason. So a lot of people were just sort of convincing themselves that they were educated based upon their own consumption of cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't necessarily understand, what is the pharmacology of cannabis? What are terpenes? What are cannabinoids? It was really just a case of, I like this product because I consume this product, and I like the effects this product produced. And at the time, as I said, I wasn't a consumer, and not being a consumer, I was kind of able to call bullshit and a lot of the information that was being presented to me as I was informed. It was, grounded in facts, whereas in reality, a lot of it was just misinformation, which had sort of existed within the industry for quite some time, whether that be the whole, indica versus sativa dichotomy of, this product's going to make everyone feel relaxing, or this product's going to make everyone feel stimulating. Soon realized that, we all have our own endocannabinoid system. The way these molecules interact with that system is very unique, such that the way a product affects me might be very different than that of yourself. And just realizing that really helped me start developing relationships with customers, whereby I just started working with them to identify, okay, previously this was the best product that you had said produced the outcome you're seeking. Mm-hmm. I understand that this product had a certain aroma to it. If we can try and find other products that have that same aroma, it's likely that that's going to be the right product for you. So just taking a little bit more of a sort of, I guess, a more personalized approach to providing product recommendations, as opposed to just saying, because I like this product, this is the product you should purchase.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, the sativa indica scenario, because obviously that's like way in the dirt kind of thing, that position, right. Use the pun, but it's quite, I was thinking about it the other day, and I just like, it's relatively handy for the introduction for people, because let's be honest, cannabis is brutally complex. So it's good to have even the endocannabinoid system, that's another extensive complexity element. So it's just, what do you use to resolve, like as an introduction, if you were to remove the sativa indica archaic approach, what would be the alternative?
I think you have to start out with telling people like cannabis affects everyone differently. I think the way I think about it is that, if you're building a house, you start out by laying a solid foundation. If you lay a faulty foundation, then any sort of structure you build on top of that is likely going to crumble in time. From my standpoint, the solid foundation, which I'd be seeking to solidify, is just giving people the information they need, even though it is going to make it like a little bit more difficult to identify the right products. Just creating realistic expectations by stating the fact that cannabis affects everyone differently. It's such an underappreciated statement, but any bud tenders I've had conversations with whereby they express that to consumers up front. They're like, oh, interesting. So that means that this product here is going to produce a specific effect for me, but it might not for you. And they're like, yeah, that's correct. Now, from there, you can really start to understand, okay, aroma is probably the best indication we have right now in terms of, is it the right product, especially if you're talking about dried flower. Talking about like edibles is probably a whole sort of other facet of the conversation, but just specifically focusing our attention on dried flower, I think from the standpoint of identifying the right product, just helping consumers sort of gain a seventh sense, in the sense that, as opposed to just purchasing the product based on aesthetics, using your nose to identify the right product is an approach which I think is probably the best current approach. Yeah. It is a little bit difficult to do that in Canada on the basis that all the products are pre-packaged, but most good stores will actually have little smell jars where you can just like pop it open and just get a sense of what the aroma is. But I think right now that's the best approach. It's by no means, an ideal approach. I think what we had prior to legalization, whereby you would come in, I could literally open up the bag of weed, which I was going to sort of pack your bag from. That approach, I think, is the best version that can exist, but unfortunately, the current regulations aren't allowing that.
It's actually quite funny that when I think about the idea of it, it's like, it's going on, it's like what we used to have is like, this is all that's on offer. It's just a big bag of stuff, and now we're dealing with this unbelievable, like breaking down, it's just fantastic. But it's quite interesting as well, you mentioned about the aroma, just for it being obviously the main identifying factor, because that obviously implies, which keeps popping up, continuously research, that terpenes have an extremely important role when it comes to the general chemical profile and the results, of the product being consumed.
100%. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest changes we see in the industry over the next 10 years. The thing about cannabis is that, it's great that there's a sort of consensus amongst a certain percentage of we'll call them the industry leaders, that this is the right approach. It's a whole other conversation whereby, you're asking retail stores to entirely reformat their current presentation of products to cater for this new information, because right now, 90% of stores, it's indica sativa hybrid, right? If we want to move away from that, it requires them to completely overhaul that layout in favor of something different. And on the basis that, number one, it's going to cost them money, of which, there isn't a lot of money to be made in cannabis retail right now in Canada at the very least. Right. So that's a big factor, which is probably going to slow this down a lot. And then secondly, that you have a lot of consumers who, even though they know they're wrong, they are 100% convinced that they are right, to the point which even if someone says to them, this model is outdated, it's actually, these terms are entirely based on the physical characteristics of cannabis plants, i.e. indicas are typically shorter with broader leaves, sativas are typically taller with narrow leaves. Yeah. They don't give a shit. Yeah. All they care about is that, for the last 10 years, this has kind of worked for me, and who are you to tell me any different?
Yeah. I mean, as a consequence really of this, I mean, you mentioned it briefly, the book that you mentioned at the beginning, obviously it kind of stirred your, obviously, revolutionary approach to what you want to do generally, but that's essentially what the approach that you're describing, the negative consequence of them, just the consumer just accepting this outdated approach, is kind of a consequence of the consumerist dynamic in the system itself. If you think about it, it's kind of simplistic. The consumer's always fed simplicity on the basis of, let's buy my product on simplicity. So it's difficult. And it's, also frustrating about this, Matthew, is that we're at the very beginning, obviously, the UK fucking way behind, but with Canada and America, this is the beginning. So the time to change 100%. And to realign with the way the industry should be is now.
Could agree more. I mean, if not now, then when? Yeah. If we can't do it now, then it's definitely not going to happen 10 years from now, because whatever about 1,000 stores having to change the format or their presentation of products. Yeah. You ask 10,000 stores to do that, and that's a multiple of a factor of 10 higher than what you're currently asking the current cohort to complete. So yeah, I think it's one of these things whereby we got to realize that we're trading accuracy for sake of simplicity, and I don't think that's a good trade-off. I think that we are so early in the innings of educating people on what cannabis is and what cannabis is not, that there's a certain responsibility we as an industry need to take upon ourselves to actually provide consumers with accurate information. Because if we aren't able to provide consumers with accurate information, are we really any better than those who came before us? Because, if you understand the prohibition of cannabis, it was entirely sort of created by virtue of spreading misinformation. Yeah. And I just think it's a little bit, I wouldn't even say ironic. I think it's a little bit hypocritical of the industry to then find itself in a position whereby we've been given a blank canvas by which to educate consumers. Mm-hmm. And as opposed to taking, the slightly more difficult route, which gets to a better outcome, we're just taking the path of least resistance, which result in consumers having this complete misconception as to what cannabis is.
Yeah, there's so many different variables, because we are dealing with that level of ignorance, and there's an emergence of the industry as a new foundation itself. But there's also 100% in concert with that is the research that's actually funding the industry itself. So there is this strange, because I mean, actually, it popped into my mind at the beginning of the week, whereas I'm researching some of the stuff for the Cannabis News Scotland episode, and I'm coming across a lot of articles that are really in depth about the cannabis industry and what's going on. And then there's other articles that are popping up like 2 days later that's from the same news outlet or anything like that, saying, what is CBD? And it's this weird polarized position that we're dealing with, where we've got some people who have no idea. Again, it's completely relevant. I bumped into an individual last week, and their opinion of cannabis was very outdated. They were very, they'd actually said, I don't interact with people who consume drugs. That was their initial approach. Yeah, and that's exactly. That's immediately, it was like alarm bells ringing in my head. And one of the things that made me laugh was, and it's a negative scenario because we do need to educate people. One of the things that made me laugh was that she'd said,
I've heard all the stories before. And I was like, oh, and then my initial response was, so you're familiar with the endocannabinoid system? And she went, what's that? And I was like, that's insane. Like, that's exactly what I did. I busted laughing. But these we are still on the ground. We are still dealing with a lot of outdated damage from, like I've said before in some of the other videos, like the cannabis situation is the longest standing propaganda campaign in human history.
100%.
You know, without a doubt.
Without a shadow of doubt. And yeah, I think people are just so bought into this idea of something being illegal, therefore it is bad. I think that's one of the main.
That's bizarre that you would say that, because she actually said that. She actually said it's illegal, therefore it's bad. That's bizarre. That's actually word for word, Matthew.
That is the justification by which they have convinced themselves that they should not consume cannabis. And I think it's just evident that that specific demographic lacks a certain ability to, critically analyze information and arrive at their own conclusion, as opposed to being dependent upon, a third party opinion as to what they should do with their lives versus what they should not do with their lives. Yeah. Like, personally, I previously had this impression that, heroin was the worst drug in the world. And I'll be dead up honest, I've never done any opiate for recreational purposes or for medicinal purposes. I've never found myself in a position whereby I needed to.
Yeah.
However, I then realized I was like, oh shit. I was like, okay, heroin might be bad, but there's fentanyl, and that's actually legal, and that's many multiples worse than that of heroin in terms of the ability to overdose on the product. Yeah. And yet that's actually legal, and heroin is illegal. So therefore, you kind of have to throw this argument out the window of something being illegal, therefore it is bad. And I think it's just a very lazy argument. I think it's just a very lazy argument for people who aren't willing to take the time to identify for themselves what is versus what is not. And I think if anyone takes like half an hour to surf the internet to understand, what is the actual research that has been conducted to date on cannabis, you will quickly arrive at the conclusion that this is actually one of the, what's the right word I'm looking for here? This is likely one of the greatest discoveries in human history, full stop.
Yeah, no, I would 100% agree, Matthew. It really is, and I think as well, it's that there is a level of irony behind. I think irony is applicable here. For the fact is that they've spent so long trying to demonize this substance, essentially for an economic and cultural prejudicial reason. Really, that's the reason why it was demonized initially. But what came to be as a result of the demonization and obviously periodically trying to analyze how it interacted physiologically, we found out that inside, as a consequence of that, we actually discovered more of ourselves as human beings, which is an insane irony that's actually difficult to comprehend. But going back to that thing about people being so indoctrinated through the ages of propaganda, there's a part of me that thinks, excluding what you'd mentioned there, that point about people actually doing independent research, because that does exclude my next point here. But I think to go back to there's this, I can't remember his name, you might actually you might know him yourself, Matthew. There's this philosopher, and he came up with the social contract, which implied that the citizen gets this level of protection from the authorities under the basis that they will act in a civilized manner. And I think that could be a subconscious tendency for people to engage with things that ordinarily wouldn't be in their line of interest, so therefore they wouldn't have any reason to study it or to be interested. So subconsciously we just assume, well, if it's been demonized by the authorities at B, therefore there is an implied basis that there's some element of wrongdoing, which again is, I could see to an extent, but as you mentioned perfectly, relatively lazy in nowadays world, because you have the internet and it would take 5 minutes of research to figure out anything to the contrary. Talking about research, actually, you put up an article recently on 4MP, which is the race to research. Could you talk a little bit about that, about the Senate and one of the bills that's been passed and the importance behind that?
Yeah, for sure. So right now, I'm not going to state a date to make myself look smart in public, because I'll probably make a fool of myself if I try and cite the specific date. But basically, for like the last 50 years, researchers in the United States have only been able to study cannabis product obtained from one specific source. I think it's the University of Mississippi, if I'm not mistaken. And the problem with that is that it does add validity to the argument which is being made, i.e. that the increased potency of cannabis product is resulting in problems. And the reason why it adds a certain element of validity is that argument is neither right nor wrong, because we find ourselves in this unfortunate position whereby, because we can't actually study the products which consumers are actively purchasing from cannabis retail stores, we cannot actually verify or dispute those claims. So it's very much just a statement they can make without anyone being able to actually rebuttal whether or not they actually feel that is true or false. So the change which is likely going to arise now as part of the infrastructure bill, which is currently being passed in the United States, currently it is bipartisan support, so it's thought that it will make its way through the House and then the Senate without too much pushback. basically what that's going to unlock is the ability for researchers in the United States to directly purchase products from cannabis retail stores, such that they can start to study what are the actual short-term and long-term effects of the current products consumers are consuming. So very interested how that plays out, because ultimately, as I mentioned on LinkedIn, there might be a surplus of cannabis in every single market where cannabis is legal, but there is certainly a shortage of cannabis research across the globe, full stop. I think there is a lot of research, a lot more research than many people are aware of as it pertains to cannabis, but I don't think we will ever have enough research such that we're armed with the right information, so that when you do meet a person on the street and they're trying to, present this argument that it's illegal, therefore it's bad, you can say, well, based upon X clinical trial, that statement is not actually grounded in facts. And here's an alternative viewpoint, and here's the data you can actually look for yourself, such that you can arrive at the same conclusion I did.
It's, again, quite interesting that the clinical trials, because there seems to be an implied basis that there maybe should be some form of alternative approach towards studying cannabis as a result of the complex chemical profile.
Cannabis is incredibly difficult to study on the basis that there is so many molecules present in the plant, which we are only beginning to understand. So previously it was thought that, THC is like the only molecule that we should give a shit about. Yeah. And to be honest, like I feel like most consumers in North America still have that perspective. And now we're starting to understand, okay, terpenes are important. And I think the next stage is going to be, okay, flavonoids are important. I barely know anything about flavonoids, if I'm being honest about it. Like I've just touched the tip of the surface. And it seems like they're rather important as well. So it's going to be difficult from a clinical trial standpoint, because normally when you do a clinical trial, it's like one molecule and you're testing the efficacy of that molecule based upon certain outcomes. So in the case of Epidiolex, they were testing THC for specific like syndromes such as Dravet syndrome. And they were trying to test, is this molecule actually producing a better outcome versus that of someone who is taking a placebo? Now, that's pretty straightforward. One molecule testing the efficacy of one outcome. When there's like 50 different molecules present, it becomes very difficult to actually identify, okay, did it work or did it fail? And did this molecule result in a better outcome? Or was it the additional component of, there was an additional 2% of flavonoids in the product? Yeah. So it's very hard to actually identify like what are the molecules which are responsible for producing the outcomes versus that of, which molecules are sort of just along for the ride.
Yeah. And sometimes I even think to myself, like the inclusion of terpenes or flavonoids is one thing, but the level of degradation that either terpene or flavonoid has actually had, again, is an additional variable. Like I was actually talking to, it's just this continuous rabbit hole of variability, and it's bizarre. And I think I was thinking about it again the other day when I was like, I really do think when cannabinoid medicine gets at its peak, the personalization of cannabinoid medicine will be a work of art.
Could agree more.
It really will be.
I think
what were you going to say?
No, all I was going to say is that I think you're going to walk into a store, and I think every single product will be presented to you based upon your prior experiences in terms of previously when you consumed X cannabis product, what was its chemical composition? And then you're trying to use that data to map onto the known chemical composition of the products available in store to say, okay, Connor, based upon this product previously producing the right outcome you're seeking, we recommend this product because it has the same cannabinoid and terpene profile. I think that's eventually where we get to. I think we're a little bit away from that, but I think inevitably that's the model which will exist.
I'm going to get a bit dystopian here, but do you know what I think to myself when it comes to like Elon Musk's Neuralink and like transferring over like physiology into the data collection realm? I think to myself, like, how much of a role is cannabis and the role that the endocannabinoid system, the analytic basis of everybody's endocannabinoid system going to play into this emerging, artificial intelligence, physiological merge, and sometimes I think just like, I'm putting the fucking joint out, tonight is over.
I've asked myself the same question, dude. For me, like, I was thinking to myself, I was like, I wonder if that technology does become mainstream, which for what it's worth, I think it will inevitably. I think you sort of have to have that mergence between the current developments that are being made in AI versus that of, just our sort of brains that have been developed over the course of a long period of time, but they are a little bit outdated, but based upon, what is probably the future trajectory of our species. I think Joe Rogan has this very sort of elegant analogy of, we're almost like a butterfly. Right. The current sort of version of humans is we're sort of the cocoon, and what then emerges thereafter is sort of the butterfly. I think there's a very high likelihood we will eventually merge with these systems. Yeah. And I've asked myself the same question. I'm like, in that world, assuming that is the way this sort of path plays out,
Yeah.
Is a place to consume cannabis, or is that just going to destroy the internal hardware? So I'm very interested to see how that's going to play out.
Sometimes I think to myself, it's like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World when he's talking about soma, and I always thought
Right.
the pharmacological element in the 60s and the 70s, I was like, oh, I must have predicted that, because obviously it was written in the 30s. But then I think to myself frequently, I was like, shit, like it's going to get to the point where cannabinoids are, I don't know, it's all inclusive, you know, it's all inclusive in this, you know, but yeah, to get fucking back on track, I'll get in a rabbit hole this year, man, honestly. But yeah, so like talking about the cannabis social clubs, then that seems to be a relatively primary method in the UK that they're considering, when obviously adult use never really gets spoken about in the UK, but obviously back channels, hidden behind the door discussions are kind of leaning towards that cannabis social clubs will be the predominance. What's going on in Spain at the moment, and how much of an impact do you think this will have on how the UK runs their situation?
I think what's interesting about the UK, to sort of take one step back a little bit further, is that if I'm not mistaken, the UK was one of the largest exporters of medical cannabis in the world for, I think it was like 5 years in a row, which is kind of ironic because, well, I wouldn't even say ironic. I'd say it's very hypocritical in that there's a lot of medical patients in the UK who can't actually obtain access to medical cannabis, despite the fact that the UK is, as I said, exporting the largest quantity of cannabis worldwide. So I think the UK will inevitably legalize cannabis. I think that Canada, being a Commonwealth nation, is likely going to have an outsized impact on the policy discussions which are currently taking place in the UK. If I'm not mistaken as well, I think there was like four UK, I would say prime ministers, but MPs, if I'm not mistaken, that's the term, members of parliament. Yeah. They actually went to Canada to kind of get a lay of the land, just to understand like what's happening here. And they all collectively agreed that this is the way forward.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think Ireland, the UK, a lot of European nations, I think, are just going to have to ask themselves, like, is this going to happen with or without our support? I think the obvious answer is that it's only going to be a matter of time until such point as these issues receive the level of support they need, such that these are made law. I'd like to think that the UK is wise enough to know that, you know, doing the social clubs is sort of a half measure. I think if they want to do the social clubs, it should be done alongside, you know, more sort of easier access retail stores.
Yeah.
I think if you do social clubs, I think it just adds to the destigmatization of cannabis, and it sort of culturally, I think it becomes an issue whereby, you know, you only really talk about cannabis in these areas, whereas what we're seeing in Canada today is just this sort of proliferation across society whereby, you know, a lot of people who previously wouldn't have never been associated with cannabis are now openly saying that they are cannabis consumers, and legalization was sort of the unlock for that door. So I'd like to think that the UK, as I said, is wise enough to know that it's going to happen eventually, you know, in our lifetime. And it just makes sense to try and be more forward thinking and position the market whereby they're not actually just, you know, doing 50% of what Canada done. They're actually going maybe 50% beyond what Canada done, because I think Canada has made a lot of mistakes. One such being the absence of social clubs, whereby you can actually get together with other cannabis consumers and consume cannabis products in that location, such as you would with alcohol in bars. So that is a mistake Canada has made. So I think if the UK could do that alongside what Canada has done from a retail standpoint, I think that would be a much better model.
It's actually quite similar to Uruguay's model. They have clubs that seem to be predominantly based in, you can get, I think, up to 90 plants or 99 plants, and then you then give that 99 plants to a government agency organization that then transfer it into medicine or whatever is necessary. And I think these are essentially clubs to an extent. I think it's the transitional, you know, it's either clubs or, you know, one or the other. But yeah, I mean, and again, one of the articles you put up is relevant to this, is because with clubs comes local employment, and you obviously in the North America at the moment, it's speculated. I quite like the estimate that you provided, which was 420,000. So that was quite nicely done. But yes, I mean, by the end of next year, there should be almost 500,000 jobs, which is obviously a hugely beneficial element to the decimated economy at the moment.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the reason why nations are going to legalize cannabis is not because myself and yourself know that they should. It's merely going to be because they're going to look at the revenue they're going to generate from making this move, and it's going to be so goddamn obvious that they need to. And yeah, I think that's really what it's all going to be about. They're going to look and they're going to say, okay, you know, we're going to generate X billion dollars in taxation revenue. A lot of that money is going to be taken away from criminal organizations. That's not to say that every single person who supplies cannabis to the quote unquote black market today isn't necessarily a member of a criminal organization. I think that's a bit of a misconception. In Canada, you know, we often like to paint the picture of the black market versus the legal market. The unfortunate truth is that there's actually a lot of gray. there's a lot of people who are in the black market who would very much like to be in the legal market, but they just can't because the regulations are so bad right now. However, in other markets, I think it'll be very, very interesting to see how it plays out.
In Uruguay, they've actually removed the basis of taxation in an attempt to really clamp down on criminality when it comes to cannabis, and it seems to have a positive impact, unless I'm mistaken, unless it's fucking went tits up. But so right at this moment, I'm going to get somebody that will send me an email or put something in the link at the bottom that'll go like, "Nah, mate, Uruguay's fucked." But yeah, no, I mean, it's like all good. It's actually talking about the cannabis social clubs, and obviously there was a quote that you put on in your article which was just excellent, and it was from a Spanish quote that says, "Private consumption of cannabis by adults as part of the exercise of the fundamental right to free personal development and freedom of conscience." That's poetic stuff. That's really relevant to what's been going on. One of the groups in the UK, We the Undersigned, they have a lot of that rhetoric, to use a negative term. Which is the reality that cannabis consumption is a human right.
I couldn't agree more. Like, it's one of these things whereby if you take the time to understand the history of cannabis, it becomes very clear why it is, in my opinion, a basic human right that anyone and everyone would have access to these products and this plant. Because for the last 12,000 years, we've been consuming this plant. It's likely been a lot longer than that, because the earliest signs is that cannabis originated in, I think it's eastern parts of Asia. And ultimately, we have documentation that we've been using cannabis for medicinal purposes for 12,000 years. However, all throughout history, the sort of important role in our own development. I don't know what I necessarily say. It's hard to say that it's necessarily played a development in our like consciousness and us becoming like quote unquote Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
But it is very clear that we have had a very strong relationship with this plant for thousands of years. And the thought that someone who you've never met in your entire life, who knows nothing about this plant, should be able to make a decision on your behalf as someone who is educated on this plant to tell you that you cannot consume this product because it's quote unquote dangerous, while simultaneously giving you permission to consume alcohol, which is one of the most destructive substances humans have ever crossed paths with, to me is just absolutely bizarre. The fact that we have a substance which we know is incredibly safe, we've been consuming, as I said, for, conservative estimate 12,000 years. And obviously we have the endocannabinoid system. That is a system which allows us to process these molecules in a way which really starts to explain why there is so much benefits obtained from this plant. And then alternatively, we have a substance which we know is a known poison. Like if you put alcohol in a concentrated state, it is literally a poison. And it has been culturally accepted such that that particular product can be consumed in any setting. It's celebrated across multiple societies. And to me, that just doesn't make sense. I think that is a pretty clear sign that we as a species are actually getting stupider, for lack of a better word. Just a sort of a degradation of our overall level of intellect. If we have collectively made a consensus that, as opposed to consuming a safe substance, we're going to consume a substance which is quite literally a poison.
It's really weird, actually, because I think this often that there's so many very explicit negatives that are in our world as humans, and it's like this weird, obviously I'm really philosophically minded, and that's what I think myself, like, the presence of all these negative elements, the presence of alcohol over something so holistic and therapeutic as cannabis, it's almost as if the pendulum is set on default mode to be negative, and we as humans are given that the basis of free will in order to really push the magnet towards the positive, to be the constructive side. I don't know. It's when I think about that, as you mentioned, alcohol, it's like I think it's like 5% of all diseases globally are caused by alcohol. 1 in 5 deaths every minute is caused by alcohol. Like, these stats are non-existent with cannabis.
Yeah, I mean, the hypocrisy is that if alcohol was illegal, it would never be made legal, full stop. Whereas with cannabis, like, it seems as though, the arguments we need to make need to be so solidified that there needs to be no basis whatsoever by which someone could formulate an argument as to why these products need to remain illegal. Like, even the argument that there's a relationship between increased cannabis consumption and psychosis. Like, it's an argument that's being made, but the problem with all those arguments that are being made is that we can't actually dispute or validate that claim on the basis that they're preventing us from doing research on the plant. So they're making these arguments knowing that we can't actually, push back on it in a way which I'd like to, i.e. we do the research, we understand, okay, this is the actual correlation that exists between excessive cannabis consumption and early onset of psychosis. And we could start to say, okay, worst case scenario, if it's in your family, whereby, you know, you have a past history of psychosis, we probably recommend you don't consume the highest THC product in a store. Alternatively, you would consume CBD products. Maybe you can start to incorporate a small amount of THC into your consumption of cannabis over time. But let's not start out with the highest version or the highest THC percentage product. And to me, that's just something which we need to take on as an industry itself, is just being more open about like what are the potential downsides of abusing cannabis, because there are people who abuse cannabis, and it's something which I don't think the industry itself is willing to necessarily admit, because there might be like a little bit of an overcorrection because there was so much misinformation saying cannabis was bad. It seems like we might have a little bit overcorrected in the sense, like trying to present this, you know, absolute narrative that cannabis is fantastic and it's this, you know, amazing discovery. It is, and I'm not trying to say it's not. However, I do think we need to be a little bit sensitive to the fact that it is not going to be all things to all people. And there are going to be a certain percentage of people who, as I said, consuming very high THC percentage products is probably not going to be the right choice for that specific person.
It's interesting as well, because I'm actually working on something at the moment. I'm not going to give too much information away about it. That's exactly, and I'm really perfect that you would bring it up, Matthew, because I've been really nervous, because when I'm ready to, it's a book, and when I'm ready to get this out, people are not going to be like, what the fuck? I thought you were on our team. You know what I mean? And that's what they're going to be like. And this is the thing, because it's like, I just thought, you know, when you said that cannabis can be abused, it's like, yeah, all I can think was like, yeah, by people that use it regularly as well.
Right.
Like this is like, I 100% have went through fluctuations of abuse, and it depends on your what's going on in your life, what you're actually doing, like your level of discipline to your daily tasks. You know, all these different factors are 100% relevant. But I thought the same thing, that we do need to have this more of a discussion about the potential for abuse, and that in order to prevent it, I mean, we have the unit measurement when it comes to alcohol. We don't have unit measurement when it comes to cannabis consumption, and also the liberty of people. I use the example of people that have epilepsy, and they go to the movies, obviously, and then there is warnings relating to there is potential that you can be harmed. You know, that should be applicable to cannabis, and then this issue would be resolved, essentially. I
think you hit the nail on the head when you said, I thought you were on our team. It's kind of that like tribal mentality of there is no middle ground. It's either, you know, you're absolutely in favor or you're absolutely against. And I hope there is room for that middle ground. I think we really need to explore. It's a very nuanced conversation. As I said, this isn't all things to all people. It's a lot of things to a lot of people. Yeah, you know, I think a lot of people have a hard time accepting the fact that, you know, I should even say, when I say cannabis, what I really should be saying is cannabinoids. I think that's more of an accurate representation of what I'm trying to convey, because I think from a medicinal standpoint, I do think the future is going to largely it's largely going to be created around, you know, trying to understand what are specific formulations which produce consistent outcomes. I don't think we as an industry are necessarily at a point in time whereby we can say this chemical composition of cannabis is going to produce this outcome. I think we need to get to that point from a medicinal standpoint, just so that we can sort of withstand the rigor of the existing systems are in place, like from the FDA, such that they can actually, you know, give their stamp of approval to say, yes, this product is going to produce that outcome. So I think ultimately what we're going to see is a shift away from it just being a cannabis industry. I think eventually there's going to be a bit of a dichotomy between cannabis and cannabinoids. I think we're seeing this in the UK and Ireland right now, whereby, you know, my granddad consumes CBD, but he would never say that he consumes cannabis, despite the fact that CBD is derived from cannabis, or, you know, hemp, which is just cannabis sativa. And I think that is going to be something we're going to see become increasingly common, is whereby people do not actually self-identify as a cannabis consumer. They will rather self-identify as a cannabinoid consumer. And I think that might be the middle ground. I think on the left, you're going to have the sort of absolute point of view of cannabis as all things to all people. In the center, you're going to have cannabinoid consumers. And then I think on the right, you're going to have, you know, cannabis is legal, it's a drug, you know, it's a gateway drug, so on and so forth. So I think the middle ground is going to be really interesting to explore over the forthcoming years.
So do you think that there should be a separate category for, so we've got vitamins, minerals, and then cannabinoids? Do you think there should be a food position other than anything else?
I think this is how it plays out. I think that's exactly how it plays out. I think that eventually cannabinoids become the equivalent of vitamins. I think there is going to be different scheduling depending upon the molecule in question. I think for THC, it's going to be a little bit, it's going to be regulated very differently versus that of CBD, which I think is the right decision anyway. I think CBD, CBN, I think most of the cannabinoids you could add to just about any product and sell it in a grocery store. I think for THC, we do need to be a little bit hesitant because, you know, high quantities of THC, just speaking from experience, can be very intoxicating, especially if you consume the wrong quantity, which has happened to date. So I think we need to be a little bit more mindful of that specific molecule. However, I think for the most part, I think the majority of cannabinoids will eventually be treated and regulated as vitamins.
Yeah.
And I think what we're going to see, and not to go too far in the rabbit hole, is right now the primary method of cultivating, or rather the primary method of producing cannabinoids is to cultivate cannabis plants. You know, you plant a seed in the ground, or you plant a clone in the ground, like what is it, like 6 to 8 weeks later, the cannabis plant grows. Eventually it produces those flowers. You harvest those flowers. From that biomass, maybe 20% of that is cannabinoids. That is a very inefficient way to produce cannabinoids, because the cannabinoids is actually a secondary metabolite of the cannabis plant. Like, cannabis doesn't mean to produce cannabinoids. It's just producing those cannabinoids as a nice byproduct. It's thought that they started producing cannabinoids because it was like some sort of protection mechanism. Not entirely sure what the story is behind that, but it's a secondary metabolite. What's likely going to happen, and it's currently happening in North America, and this is very much not being talked about, which is why I want to sort of bring the spotlight on it, is that there is an alternative way by which you produce cannabinoids, and it's just using what's called biosynthesis. So it's not, you're not synthesizing these molecules in the same way like K2 and spice, which are synthetic cannabinoids. The biosynthesis of cannabinoids produce what's called cultured cannabinoids, which are actually 100% organic molecules. And what's really interesting about this approach is that right now today, the agricultural supply chain of cannabis, so as I said, cultivating cannabis plants, realistically only provides us with access to like 4 cannabinoids, and really only 2 in a large enough quantity such that they've been commercialized, which is CBD and THC. There is 140 cannabinoids that we know of. The problem is that the current agricultural supply chain cannot actually produce these cannabinoids in a great enough quantity for them to be commercialized. With this new approach, you could effectively biosynthesize and produce these cannabinoids at scale at a cost reduction, which I've been told might be somewhere in the region of about 80%. So you reduce the cost by about 80%, while at the same time providing access to 140 different cannabinoids as opposed to 2. And I think at that point in time, I think that's where we're going to see the real shift away from there being a cannabis industry. Cannabis industry is dried flower. And then there's a cannabinoid industry, which is edibles, vapes, and just about any product you can name, which you would potentially add a cannabinoid to.
See, that's exciting, because one of the things that keep popping in my mind as you're speaking there, Matthew, was the reduction in the CO2 footprint as a result 100%. Of that. That's a huge impact. That's one of the things that's a real explicit negative when it comes to the cannabis industry emerging. Right. I don't know if it's a similar mechanism, but the way that they synthesize, then, to use, if that's the correct methodology, the correct wording, is it through the method of yeast? I mean, I've seen this in one of the processes that they used yeast to synthesize THC, and at the same sense, do you know how applicable and how relevant, how consistent are these cannabinoids to cannabinoids produced in this standard method?
So my understanding, and I should say, like, I'm not an expert on this.
No, of course,
I've had a few conversations with a few CEOs of companies who are kicking ass in this area, and they've brought me up to speed as to what's currently happening in their labs. So the consistency is going to be that of what a pharmaceutical company would be seeking to obtain. So you're talking like 99.999% level of consistency. Right. And that is also a huge problem in the cannabis industry today, because we currently have an agricultural supply chain. There is a huge level of inconsistency in the chemical composition of the same branded products. So if I go into a store, and just making up a name here, I buy, a half an ounce of Hindu Kush from Canopy Growth. Maybe people are familiar with that name.
Yeah.
If I purchase that product a month later, there's a very high likelihood that the same branded product is going to have a very different cannabinoid and terpene profile, because it was produced in a different grow room. It was produced at a different time. Perhaps that plant didn't get the same amount of light exposure as the previous batch did. Thus, it produces a different outcome.
Yeah.
Ultimately, if I walk into a grocery store, that can of Coke that I buy today is the same version which I purchased a week ago, and it's the same version which I purchased, a year before that and a year before that, because it's the same formulation. Yeah. So I think if cannabis is going to become a CPG industry, like a consumer packaged good industry, whereby, as I said, name the company, name the brand, they're likely going to have a portfolio whereby they simply add cannabinoids to their existing products. I think at that point in time, it's a much easier sort of plug-in for them to work with these cultured cannabinoid companies, whereby they can just state, okay, I need this quantity of this cannabinoid at this date, and have that received to them such as they would with any other ingredient, versus that of having to wait 8 to 10 weeks just so that they can obtain biomass, of which there is going to be a huge level of inconsistency in terms of what is actually in that product.
Yeah. Well, I think to be devil's advocate, one of the negatives towards that is to remove the. But I suppose that's maintained with the personal grower. So I think
Right.
what I was going to suggest there was obviously to remove away the cultivation element, is to remove this. Not spiritual is a different word, but an intimate relationship between humanity and the plant itself. But let's be honest, that's
Right.
the individual does that in their own home. We're talking about a global influence here, and I think that the main positive towards this is the CO2 footprint. That will be a huge benefit to this. I mean, hypothetically, like speculating on that, Matthew, what's the potential then in the next 5 years? Do you think that will be possible in the next 5 years?
I've been told less than that. However, I think a lot of the people who are building this technology might be a little bit over optimistic as to, I mean, I'm sure they want to achieve those timelines. Whether they will achieve those timelines remains to be seen. However, I think there's a lot of potential that within the next 5 years, this will become extremely mainstream. And to your point, I actually don't think we're going to see a decline in the consumption of dried flower.
Right.
I think what's going to happen is that ultimately, when you achieve that cost reduction in the cost of producing cannabinoids, I think we're going to see a lot more CPG companies start to add cannabinoids to their existing portfolios, as I mentioned. And at that point in time, it's going to become hugely destigmatized to be a consumer of cannabinoids. And at that point in time, as people quickly realize that, smoking cannabis is just, the inhalation of cannabinoids, it's just a different form factor, a different way to consume this product. I think that completely changes the conversation. So I think the prerequisite to the normalization of cannabis is the normalization of cannabinoids. Once we achieve a normalization of cannabinoids, and then you explain to people that, this is just a different way to consume cannabinoids, I think at that point in time, we can expect to see a huge sort of cultural shift, whereby I think consuming cannabis will be as normal as consuming caffeine. I think that's the best analogy. I think the alcohol analogy is awful. I think it's a terrible analogy. I think from a regulatory standpoint, it makes sense. They kind of look similar today. I think long-term, as I said, this is very much going to be something similar to vitamins or that of caffeine.
Yeah. I certainly hope so, and I really hope it's the same again quicker than 5 years. It does seem, it's frustrating when you look over at the news internationally, and obviously the UK. There is positive movements. There has been a lot done in the past year, but there's not enough done. I think for people that have been engaged with this scenario their entire life, it can never be quick enough. But yeah, I mean, just you mentioned it briefly about the Canopy Growth. That's obviously a corporation when it comes to cannabis. Is that Houseplant and the situation that they had with Canopy Growth, obviously, where they, in your article, where it kind of showed that the corporate mass production isn't as efficient as small scale craftsmanship when it comes to cannabis growing. Could you elaborate a little bit on that article?
Yeah, I could indeed, and I'll try and sort of incorporate in my last point, whereby I mentioned that the future is whereby we use this alternative method of production. So I think that there will always be a high demand for flower, no pun intended. And I think that's going to be about 20% of the market. I think right now, if I'm not mistaken, that's about 70% of all products sold in Canada today is dried flower. I think long-term, that's going to be more realistically be like 20%. I think you're going to see a lot of people coming into the market whereby they're consuming beverages and, vapes and topicals and edibles, because I don't know about you, but I know a lot of people in my family would be very much opposed to the inhalation of cannabis, whereby if you offer them a beverage, they'd be like, why not? Something they're familiar with, and it just doesn't carry the same stigma as having to smoke something.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think what we're going to see is Canopy Growth, Afria, Organigram, name your big licensed producer in Canada. I think the investments that they've made in producing these quote unquote state-of-the-art cultivation facilities, they're going to quickly realize that was one of the worst investments they ever made, because if you're producing flower with the intent to sell that product as dried flower, you need to focus on quality over quantity. Canopy made the decision that they wanted to focus on quantity over quality, such that they could offset the impression of their investors that they had the potential to supply the entire market. Now, the problem is that there's a lot of craft growers who are starting to come online, and they only have one job, which is to produce the best goddamn flower in the entire Canadian market. Whereas for Canopy, they have 6 different form factors. They have like 30 different brands, and they're trying to figure out, what does every single one of the consumers of those products want, and how do we provide them with the best version of that product? Whereas if you're the craft grower, you have one single job to focus on, which is producing the best flower possible. So I think what we're going to see is there's going to be this shift whereby dried flower is going to remain popular. However, I think what we're going to see is a ever increasing percentage of the supply is going to be coming from craft producers. And I think that a lot of the existing quote unquote state-of-the-art cultivation facilities are probably going to be sold off and are likely going to be used for like the cultivation of just normal plants, whether that be like potatoes or carrots or what have you. And with that, Houseplant made the decision that they wanted to terminate the relationship with Canopy on the basis that the products that they were supplying under their brand were just so low quality as compared to what is currently available on the market, currently being supplied by craft producers, that they just had to make the decision to distance themselves from that, because a lot of consumers are quite pissed off as to the lack of quality of the products the larger producers were supplying. Not that they do have a choice. They are choosing to vote with their dollars, that they don't want to support these companies. Instead, they want to support the smaller craft producers. Even though the product is a little bit more expensive, the product is just so much higher in quality that it is worth those extra dollars.
I think it's one of the things where it kind of gave excitement and enthusiasm and hope when I read your article, really, because that's one of the things where we constantly look in the UK, we're looking 5 years along the line. So it's like, what? I mean, most people, apart from mainstream medical CBD hemp individuals who are part of those sectors, most people are looking towards what's the UK adult use market going to look like, and I think that's one of the huge talking points, that there's always the potential with any new industry of monopolization through corporate interest, and I think one of the best method to prevent that from happening is community orchestrated growth, and it does seem to be that craftsmanship comes hand in hand with small reduction in quantity, increase in quality kind of thing,
Absolutely. I think it's going to be very popular in every single market, even though there might not necessarily be that legacy of the cultivation of cannabis in Ireland. Not that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are people who've been cultivating cannabis here for longer than I was even born, or longer before I was even born. But I don't think there's that same culture of cannabis in Ireland. Like if you go to BC, like there are thousands of people who've been growing cannabis there for generations. I don't know is that necessarily applicable in Ireland. However, I find it hard to believe that there won't be cannabis collectives and there won't be craft cannabis producers. I think there's going to be that model in every single market. And the reason why is that there's a connection with this plant, but there's also a connection with the people who are responsible for the cultivation of this plant. And you can either choose to support a very large corporation by virtue of what products you purchase, or alternatively, you can support the craft cannabis producer whom you have conversations with on Twitter, whom you understand, is pouring every single ounce of energy into the cultivation of this plant on a daily basis. And it's really just about forming that connection. Like we connect with brands. Like I personally only wear Nike shoes because I connect with Nike as being the sort of the brand of athletes. And as such, I like to sort of self-identify as someone who's athletic. For a lot of people, they want to be supporting the people who are actually, in the industry because they love cultivating this plant. And I think ultimately, we're going to see this play out across every market. And if we don't, I'll definitely be I wouldn't say regretting the fact that we won't see that, but I think if not for regulations constraining the ability for that model to exist, I think it's inevitability that we'll see that model exist in, as I said, every single market.
Do you know what I think it is? It's because anybody that's before, who's been smoking 20 plus years and that kind of stuff, more than that, will be like familiar that the cannabis community was always anti-capitalist. That's what that was. Right. It was always 100% the anti-capitalist perspective. So I think that's where it just feels like I see myself as this old man looking onto these young people that are like, with their brand, and I'm fuck off, man. You didn't know what you were smoking. That's what it used to be.
That's brilliant.
But before we wrap up here, Matthew, what would you like to add anything else? How do you see the industry playing out in the next 5 years?
I think we're going to see a lot of nations legalizing weed in the next 5 years. I think, as I said, as we mentioned in the earlier part of the conversation, it's largely going to be from an economic standpoint as to why these decisions are being made. Obviously, COVID hurt a lot of countries' budgets. They are now running pretty large deficits. They need to recoup that money. And I think cannabis is the elephant in the room. Like every single state and every single nation that has thus far legalized cannabis has generated, billions of dollars in taxation revenue. And I think our generation is very much encouraging a more common sense approach to cannabis, whereby the way we view cannabis is completely different versus that of, say, like a generation above us who were very much indoctrinated by, the war on drugs and all that propaganda. So I think ultimately we're going to see so much change in this industry in the next 5 years. I'm a little bit optimistic that there's going to be a standardization of policies across the EU. I think if that happens, the EU, or Europe, I should say, would become one of the most exciting cannabis markets in the world. But besides that, we're going to see the entirety of North America having legalized cannabis for adult use purposes within 5 years. I would bet my house on that. Obviously we've Canada already. Mexico is on course to do it by the end of this year. And by the looks of it, I'd say if the United States don't do it this year, it'll inevitably happen in 4 years' time. So if nothing else changes bar that, I think that's a huge statement of the rest of the world, because ultimately the war on drugs started in North America. And if we see the collapse of cannabis prohibition in the United States, then it's only a matter of time until the dominoes start to fall elsewhere.
Yeah. I fully agree, Matthew. And like I say, just to keep working hard. I'll put all the links to your 4PM. Before we go, actually, what are you expecting in the next 6 to 12 months with 4PM?
Honestly, for ourselves, it's always just been about providing content which is of relevancy to cannabis professionals and more broadly people who are interested in the industry, and talking about the industry in a way which anyone can understand and anyone can appreciate the relevancy of the information, because there's a lot of people out there who just like to report the news on cannabis, but I think they take for granted that there's a very small percentage of the population who might understand why that information is of relevancy. So the approach that we've always taken is here's the event that has occurred, but here's why it's relevant in the here and the now, and here's why you think it's of relevance to the future of the industry, and just maintaining a strong focus on the future of this industry, because we are very much in the earliest days of building this industry. And despite the fact that there are already billion-dollar companies that exist, I think it's important to remember that cannabis is only legal in like 1% of nations worldwide, and if that means this isn't the beginning, then I don't know what would better convey that.
Yeah, certainly very exciting, Matthew. And let's say keep working hard. Your newsletter is absolutely awesome. I've subscribed, expecting daily excitement when it comes to the cannabis industry. And thanks for joining me, Matthew. I've really enjoyed this.
My absolute pleasure.
Thanks to Matthew for giving me his time, and thanks to you for sticking around until the end of the video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the content. I'll see you next time.